Hey guys, I'm planting my tomatoes today. Now you may be doing this now, maybe you've already done it, or maybe you still have to do it. I'm late. But I was thinking about all the mistakes I made over the last, I don't even know how many years at this point, 30 years, on growing tomatoes. So I wanted to make this video detailing the top 10 mistakes that you can make when growing tomatoes and what you can do to either avoid them or fix them once you've done them. So getting right into it, the first mistake you could make is not knowing the type of tomato plant you're growing. Now this could mean a couple things. The first thing would be what type of tomato plant you're actually growing. Determinate, indeterminate, cherry tomato. Usually you're going to see that information on the tag. If you don't have the tag or it doesn't say it, just find out what variety it is and Google it and say, is this a determinate or indeterminate? Determinate is like a Roma tomato that grows about 3 feet tall, puts on all of its fruit almost all at once, and then that's it. It's done. An indeterminate tomato, most of the tomatoes we grow from the garden center or anywhere else, they grow all season long and produce all season long. And depending on your climate and the length of your growing season, that determines how much fruit you get, because it grows until the frost comes to kill it, and it will produce that whole time. So in my climate here in zone 9B, 10A, it's not uncommon for tomatoes to produce from, depending on how early you plant them, I'm getting a late start this year, from May or June all the way through December. Now, don't be too jealous, because once we get into like late October through December, the tomatoes it's producing, they don't taste that great. Now, another thing we could be talking about on the type of tomato plant is an heirloom, a hybrid, open pollinated. Now, really, the only reason you need to know these is if you're going to try to save seeds from this year's tomato to grow next year. If you get a hybrid, which most of the ones at the garden center are hybrids, you can save the tomato seeds, but 9 times out of 10, they're not going to produce next year what they produced this year. It will be a variation of it, maybe one of the 2 parents of that hybrid plant. That's what it's going to produce. Whereas an open pollinated or heirloom is, open pollinated means you can save the seeds, plant them next year, and they're going to come back and be 99% of what you expected they're going to be. And an heirloom is an open pollinated seed or plant, but it just has a longer history to it. Okay, the second mistake you might have made already, hopefully not if you've watched some other of my videos, is not planting tomatoes in too much shade. Tomatoes like sun. Full sun, at least 6 to 8 hours. More would be ideal, unless you live in a southern climate, the United States, the south part of the United States, or any climate where you routinely see long stretches of periods throughout the growing season from 85 degrees or more Fahrenheit up. Tomatoes don't like that much heat. They like a lot of sun and they like heat, but not that much heat. And so what's going to happen is when you have that much heat for a long period, it's going to start to abort its flowers. And that means it's just dropping those flowers off because it doesn't want to waste its energy producing more fruit. It's going to focus its energy on ripening the fruit that it's already set. Now, if you live in those places where you get those higher temperatures, I would plant them where they're only going to get maybe 6 hours of sunlight a day if that's possible. And for those really hot spells, maybe only a week or 2 at a time here and there, you can go ahead and keep some shade cloth, 35% shade cloth. Just keep it on hand and just go out there on those hot days, toss it over the plants, and that will bring the temperature down just enough to hopefully save those flowers and keep it producing. Now, if you're in like Texas, I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen for you. But you're blessed with a long growing season, so you can grow early in the year and you can grow late in the year. But those hot summer months, you're going to want to avoid those. Now, you can grow them through those summer months, kind of baby them along a little bit, and then they'll start producing again in the fall, but probably not in the most extreme areas. Now, the third mistake is planting incorrectly. This is a mistake that a lot of people make. And I gotta say, in this video, this is actually a mistake of a mistake, or correcting a mistake, or something I didn't know that I know now. For years, the majority of the advice out there was to plant tomatoes deep, because tomatoes have the ability to create roots all along their stem wherever it touches ground. And so that's what kind of we've all been saying for as long as I can remember. But this last year I did an experiment, and I watched some other people do some experiments, and it seems to be the consensus is yes, the plants do grow roots all along their stem, but by the end of the season, those plants that have been planted deeper did not produce any more fruit than the plants that were just planted at ground level. So it's a lot more time and work to dig the extra holes. Not doing it anymore. More tips like these can be found on our free online garden guide. I'll leave a link down in the video description. Now, along the same lines with planting, you might not give the plant the nutrients it needs to produce the types of harvests you're wanting. You need to give it a good start and then keep it going throughout the season. One of the biggest things a tomato needs for fruiting is phosphorus and potassium. Now, on a bag or box of fertilizer, those are the last two numbers. So I always add phosphorus and potassium at planting time. Now, I do that in the form of Neptune's Harvest crab and lobster and kelp meal. You could also do this with a general organic fertilizer that has a high middle number of phosphorus, and make sure that last number has a good amount too. Between these two, they get everything they need in a natural form. The kelp also has a ton of micronutrients and minerals in it, so it just gives that tomato a broad spectrum of things that it needs to produce not only a lot of fruit, but healthy fruit. And so I just put some of this in the hole for each plant that I plant. And because this has got such big chunks in it, it's kind of a slow release and immediate release fertilizer all in one. Now, if you've already planted your tomatoes and you've skipped this step, it's not too late. Just dig down all the way around the plant, about 5 inches from the stem, about 3 inches down, and mix the fertilizer in there. That will be fine. The reason we've put the phosphorus especially under the soil is it doesn't move through the soil as easily as other nutrients do. Now, while we're talking about fertilizer, a lot of people make another fertilizing mistake, and that is to add too much nitrogen. Nitrogen is the first number on a bag or box of fertilizer, and that is for green leafy growth. And it's gonna give you a huge plant, but not a lot of fruit. And so if you've ever grown tomatoes and they get the jungle going on and you can't even see the minimal amount of fruit that you get off those plants, one of the reasons is too much nitrogen. So throughout the growing season, I'm going to use a fertilizer. I'm not going to give no nitrogen, but I'm going to use a fertilizer. Happens to be Neptune's Harvest. It's a liquid. It's the tomato and veg formula, and it's a 2-4-2. So the highest number is the phosphorus. If you're not using Neptune's Harvest, try to look for a organic fertilizer that has a high middle number, a low first number. The last number is kind of whatever it happens to be. It's okay. Now, when you're planting the tomatoes, you want to maintain the proper spacing between your tomato plants. Now, I'm going to be growing my tomatoes the way I always do, and that is up a string. It's called a cordon. And that is a single stem all the way up the string. We take off all the side growth. And so because I'm doing it that way, I can fit more tomatoes in a small space. I can fit a tomato every 12 to 15 inches doing it this way. Now, if you're growing an indeterminate tomato and you're not doing it this way, you're gonna need about 4 to 5 feet between each one. Now, we're gonna get into why I do this in a minute. If you're growing a cherry tomato, about 4 to 5 feet between each one. If you're growing a determinate tomato, a good 2 to 3 feet spacing is adequate. So the next mistake is not providing the proper support for your tomatoes. Now, I know that going far back, my grandparents, my parents, if they grew their tomatoes, they grew them on tomato cages, right? We've all seen them. We've probably all used them. The problem is, unless they're really strong, they're not going to hold up any tomato. If you have a strong one, it'll be good for maybe a determinate. If it's really strong, it'll be good for a cherry tomato. But indeterminate tomatoes, they grow and grow and grow, and they're gonna overwhelm that tomato cage in no time. And a lot of these tomato cages you get at the garden center, they break by the time you get them home. One of the rings falls off or whatever, so they're not gonna hold the weight of an indeterminate tomato. There's lots of other ways you can do it on different types of trellises, but like I said before, I do mine the cordon method up a string. It's super easy. You can fit way more tomatoes in a smaller space. You get them up off the ground, away from pests, away from disease on the ground. And if they're pruned properly, which I'm going to get into next, it keeps the airflow through the plant. You're going to get a lot less disease, especially if you live in a humid climate. So that brings us to the next one, and that is not pruning your tomatoes. Maybe we're going to make this A and B, pruning. The first mistake on pruning is actually pruning cherry tomatoes or determinate tomatoes. You don't want to prune those except for shape. If they're getting out of bounds and you got to cut them back a little bit to allow the path to be there, then you can do that. But you're not going to cut them any more severely than that, because those types of tomatoes, they produce on almost all the stems that they create, they'll produce fruit on. Indeterminate tomatoes, on the other hand, they produce most of their fruit, and I'm talking 90% of their fruit, along the main stem, not on the side branches that they put out. Now you can look on a tomato plant, and in the armpit of the tomato, which is where the leaf meets the stem, you're going to see some growth there. I pinch all those out throughout the season. I don't allow any side growth, because each one of those is basically going to make its own tomato plant, but not produce hardly any tomatoes. So it's going to sap a lot of energy out of the plant for nothing except a lot of green leafy growth. So I pinch all those out all season long, and I twist the plant around the string to give it support, and it just grows all the way to the top of that string. Now I have a video I just did on this. It's actually gone crazy. People have loved this video because it's the most detailed presentation I've given in 6-7 years on how to do this properly, the entire system. So I'm going to link that down below. Definitely check that out. So you're going to get all the benefits of, fitting more plants into a small space, less disease. You're going to get the fruit up off the ground away from the pests. So check that out. It will definitely be worth your time. And even if you've planted your tomatoes, you can still use this method. Along with pruning, you're going to find at the bottom of tomato plants, as they get taller, the leaves are going to start turning yellow and brown. That doesn't necessarily mean they're diseased. They're just old. They're not providing any help to the plant anymore. So I cut those off first as they show up, to just keep the place neat. It keeps the airflow open, and it takes off the weaker leaves that are now old and they're more susceptible to disease. So you can kind of head disease off at the pass by keeping your plants clean and tidy. And this is especially important if you live in a humid, rainy summer climate. This is almost a necessity. I've heard from so many of you who have switched to this method who live in the southern United States, and it just absolutely was a game changer for your disease issues, because the plants don't like wet leaves. And so growing them this way, there's a lot less dampness. That naturally brings us to our next mistake, and that is improper watering. Tomatoes are a disease-prone plant, and this especially in a wet climate. So don't add more to it by spraying the area with the hose. If it rains, it rains. We can't control that unless you grow in a greenhouse. But for the most part, we can't control it. But you can control where you put your hose. Don't spray the leaves. If you're going to water with a hose, put it in like a mason jar, the end of the hose, to soften the water spray, and lay it at the base of the plant. So it just waters the base, the ground, where the water needs to be, not up on the fruit or on the plant. Now, I use drip irrigation. I think that is the best way to water tomatoes. I put the drip irrigation down, put mulch on top of it, and the plants do not get wet. It doesn't rain here in the summer, almost at all. But even if you live where it rains, that should be the only water touching your plants. Drip irrigation allows that to be the case, especially when it's buried under drip. The reason I put the hose in a jar and soften that is because even laying the hose on the ground or in the process of doing it, you get splash back. The water hits the ground, splashes up to the stem or the leaves. The spores and the bacteria are in the soil. And when they hit, they're going to grab onto that water droplet and ride it up to the leaf, where they're going to just kind of go crazy in that environment, especially if it's damp, and multiply and possibly kill your plant. With the fresh mulch on top of the soil, it gives you that extra layer of protection from whatever pathogens or bacteria are in the soil. Now, how do you know how much water to give your tomato? They like a consistently moist, not soggy, but moist soil. So just take your finger and push it down into the soil a couple of inches. If you feel moisture, don't water. If it's dry, water. If you've ever had your fruit crack either around or on the top, that is due to a lack of water and then a bunch of water. So if you haven't watered your plants in a while, forget, say, oh, well, I gotta water the plants, put a whole bunch of water on there. Think of a human being, when they gain a lot of weight, what happens? We get stretch marks. It's the same with the tomato. They're kind of sitting there with not enough water, and then they suck up all the water you give them and bust their skin open. If you've ever had blossom end rot, that's caused by a lack of calcium in the plant, not in the soil. There's usually plenty of calcium in the soil, but without water to move the calcium from the soil into the plant, it doesn't work. So keep your plants evenly moist. We talked about blossoms falling off and not making fruit. Overwatering can do that as well. If you have no heat issues and your blossoms are falling off, it could be overwatering. Now, another reason the flowers might fall off is lack of pollination. We're living in a time with less bees, less pollinators. The good thing about tomatoes is they have perfect flowers, meaning they have both the male and the female reproductive parts in the same flower really close together. And so it's very easy for us to be the bee. If you want to take a paintbrush and just brush it on each flower, if you want to use an electric toothbrush, the buzz, the hum of the toothbrush just touching the back of it to the flower will be enough to jostle the pollen where it needs to be. Or if you've got them on strings, you can just bang the string. If you've got them on cages or whatever the trellis is, just hit that trellis or cage, and that's enough usually to jostle that pollen loose. Now you want to do this when it's dry outside, not when it's wet, because if it's wet, the pollen is kind of sticky. It's not like ready to poof and float where it needs to float. Okay, the last mistake you might be making is not paying attention to your tomato plants and what they're trying to tell you. Now, this might be because you never go to your garden except to harvest. I recommend a daily walk through your garden, maybe in the morning with a cup of coffee, or at night, or whenever it is, just to keep an eye on things. You'll be able to see things right when they're starting to happen and get ahead of it. You might see some spots on your tomatoes, maybe some wilting of the leaves, curling of the leaves, maybe the first signs of a tomato hornworm, the little poops or being eaten on. If you don't come out but once a week, those problems can take over your patch before you even know what's happening. Now, to prevent pests and disease naturally, so you don't have to deal with them in the first place, watch this video right here. It's going to show you the best scientific-based companion plants to put with your tomatoes to help keep them free of diseases and pests. I'll see you guys next time.